They sold everything for $200, even his Shelby. My husband's 1967 Shelby, the one he rebuilt with his own hands, the one he polished on Sundays like a man tending to something sacred. The buyer called me laughing. I can still hear that sound, bright and careless, as if he were telling me the punchline of some harmless joke, and not informing me that my entire past had been boxed, labeled as trash, and traded for the price of a grocery run. I didn't answer him that day, not because I was shocked, though I was, but because some part of me, the older, quieter part, that knows when a wound is too deep to probe, understood that his laughter wasn't about cruelty. It was about disbelief. He had just witnessed someone hand him a lifetime of memories for the price of a cheap dinner, and he couldn't make sense of it. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark kitchen, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, listening to the settling sounds of a house that had learned to live without him years ago. I am 78 now, old enough to know better. Old enough to know that pain doesn't always announce itself with sirens. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like fog creeping under the door, unnoticed until you can't see anything clearly anymore. I live alone in a one-story house whose walls don't echo the way our old home used to, back when my husband would laugh so hard the pictures tilted slightly on their nails. These days, the laughter that visits me comes mostly from memory, thin and worn like a photograph that's been touched too many times. But the night I got that phone call, the past returned not as nostalgia, but as a knife, scraping along the inside of my chest with slow, deliberate pressure. I remember staring at the cluttered counter, covered in coupons and cooling racks and the half-finished crossword puzzle, and thinking that maybe I had imagined what he said. Maybe it wasn't the Shelby. Maybe it wasn't everything. Maybe they had left something, anything, that proved my life mattered more than a quick cash grab. I turned on the light, and the kitchen looked the same, warm and tired, like an old friend who never asked too much, but I didn't feel at home in it, not that evening. That evening I felt like a guest in the ruins of someone else's story. I had trusted them, my son and his wife, more than I had ever trusted myself. I believed that family, no matter how cracked or strained, would never cross certain lines. I believed in the invisible agreements we pretend bind us to one another. Respect, gratitude, simple decency. But there is a cruelty that hides inside convenience, a quiet selfishness people mistake for practicality, and that is the force that gutted my storage unit and left me sitting in my kitchen holding a phone that had just delivered a truth I wasn't prepared to hear. I suppose I should explain who I am, though I've learned that introductions often reveal less than we expect. I am a widow of nearly 9 years. A mother of one son who has grown into a man I sometimes recognize only by the shape of his shoulders, and a woman who once believed love could be stretched to cover every flaw until the day it finally snapped. I used to be someone who kept every birthday card, who ironed handkerchiefs, who labeled boxes with careful handwriting so future me would know where to find whatever she might someday need. I suppose that was my mistake, believing the future version of myself would ever be shown those boxes again. The storage unit wasn't just a place to keep things. It was the archive of everything I had been before. Grief hollowed out the center of my life. His workbench, his metal toolbox with the dent on the lid from the day he dropped it after swearing at the carburetor like it were a living thing. His leather jacket that still smelled faintly of oil and cedar when I tucked it away. The spare parts he insisted on saving because one day we'll fix her up completely, Mar. And I believe he meant it, even when age slowed him down and illness stole pieces of him faster than we could hold them. That unit was the closest thing I had left to a conversation with him, but they didn't see that. My son's wife saw clutter. She saw inconvenience. She saw a bill she didn't want me paying anymore. And instead of asking, instead of offering to help in a way that honored what the place held, she walked in with bolt cutters. Yes, bolt cutters, I learned later. And cleared it out so thoroughly you would think my husband had never existed at all. I don't know when they stopped seeing me as a woman and started seeing me as a burden. Maybe it happened slowly as I started forgetting small things. A birthday here, a date there. Maybe it was the day I called my son twice because I couldn't remember if I'd told him about the new medication. Maybe it began even earlier, the moment I became inconvenient to the narrative of comfort they built for themselves. Families don't always fracture with shouting. Sometimes they split along the quietest seams. So there I sat that evening, 78 years old, wrapped in the dim silence of a house too small to hold the shock I was feeling, replaying the man's laughter in my mind. Not angry at him, but stunned that he knew more about what was done to me than my own child had bothered to tell me. And in that long, slow hour after the call ended, when the tea grew colder and the sky outside darkened into an indifferent blue, I realized something I had avoided admitting for a long time. I was no longer living inside a family. I was living adjacent to one, allowed in only when convenient, left out whenever my presence became too heavy, too real, too tied to a history they didn't want the responsibility of carrying. The Shelby was more than a car. It was a promise, a memory of a life where I was loved without conditions. And the moment I learned it had been sold for $200 without a second thought, I understood that the betrayal had not begun that day. It had begun years earlier, quietly, invisibly, and only now was I seeing the full shape of it. That was the night something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a small, decisive turn of the heart, the kind that says, enough. The call from the buyer should have been the worst part, but it wasn't. The real blow came the next morning when I finally worked up the courage to call the storage facility, half hoping they would tell me it was all some misunderstanding, that maybe the buyer had exaggerated, or that some clerical error had mixed up my unit with someone else's. I waited through 3 rounds of that tinny hold music, the kind that sounds like it's being played through a straw, and when the manager finally picked up, her voice was so casually apologetic that I knew instantly she had no idea she was speaking. Into the rubble of my life, she said, "Oh, yes, the woman, your daughter-in-law, she cleared it all out last week. Signed the release and everything. We even asked if she needed help loading it. She said she had it under control." And just like that, in a single unguarded sentence, the truth unfolded with the bluntness of a hammer. It had been planned, prepared, executed. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't some rushed decision made under stress. It was the deliberate erasure of decades wrapped in the neat efficiency that my daughter-in-law always prided herself on. I don't remember what I said in response because the words left me before the meaning settled in. I think I thanked her. I think I said I appreciated her time. I might have even said, "Have a good morning," the way people do when they're trying to keep their voice from cracking. I just remember hanging up and staring at the tiled floor, the pattern swimming slightly as if the room were gently tilting, though the house was perfectly still. It wasn't until after I set the phone down that I realized something inside me had gone quiet, the same way a house goes silent after all the lights are turned off. Not peaceful, not resting, but drained of heat. I sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the sunlight bending across the surface like a thin ribbon, and I thought of all the times I had visited that storage unit alone, carrying a thermos of coffee because I couldn't bear to open those boxes without something warm to hold. I would sit on the little wooden stool my husband had used when he worked on the Shelby, the same stool I kept near the entrance of the unit, and I would talk to him in the dim, dust-moted light, as though he were just on the other side of the wall. Every piece inside that room was a thread connecting me to the version of myself I had been with him, steadier, younger, braver. And now those threads had been cut by the two people I trusted, or tried to trust, or forced myself to trust, because the alternative would have been to admit that I had spent years loving people who didn't know how to love me back. The worst part wasn't even that they sold the Shelby. The worst part was realizing that no one had thought I deserved to be told. I replayed the last few conversations I'd had with my son, hearing them differently now, catching the rehearsed casualness in his voice, the gentle nudges he'd made about letting go of the past, as if the past were a stack of old magazines and not the very soil that held the roots of who I was. I remembered the way my daughter-in-law would smile in that tight, managerial way and say things like, "We should help you simplify, Mom. You don't need all that old stuff. It's not healthy to cling." But she never asked what those boxes contained, never asked whose hands had built the things she so eagerly discarded, never asked why I kept them. To her, my memories were clutter. My grief was clutter. My love was clutter. I didn't start crying right away. The tears didn't come in a rush like they do in the movies, falling beautifully onto trembling hands. No, mine arrived with humiliating slowness, gathering at the corners of my eyes until my vision blurred, sliding down my cheeks as though ashamed to show themselves. It felt wrong to cry over things, but then again, they weren't just things. When you lose a person, you cling to whatever pieces of them the world hasn't yet taken. Those pieces were gone now, passed into the hands of strangers who didn't know the stories behind them, who didn't know that the grease-stained jacket once wrapped around the man who taught me how to drive, who didn't know that the dented toolbox held the screwdriver he used to tighten the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet because I had asked him to fix it for weeks. I wiped my face with the edge of my sleeve and tried to stand, but my knees didn't want to hold me just yet. Age does that. It makes grief heavier. Younger people think heartbreak happens in the chest, but when you're older, the pain sinks lower. It settles into the joints, the spine, the places that already ache. I leaned against the counter and breathed slowly, telling myself the way I used to tell my husband when he grew impatient with himself, one moment at a time, just one. When the shaking finally passed, I reached for my purse, more out of instinct than decision. I needed proof. I needed confirmation that the betrayal was complete and not merely imagined. I drove to the storage facility, gripping the steering wheel too tightly, as if the car were the only thing tethering me to the earth. The building looked the same as always. Rows of identical metal doors, each one a quiet vault of someone's life. I walked to mine even though I already knew it would be empty. Still, I needed to see it. Familiar ritual can sometimes soften the blow, but when I turned the key and pushed the door up, the sound of the metal rattling echoed through a space that no longer belonged to me. It was hollow, vacant, stripped of presence. Not a speck of sawdust, not a forgotten washer, not a scrap of paper remained. It looked like a mouth held open in shock. I stepped inside, and the emptiness clung to my skin like an unwelcome hand. This was the room where I used to kneel beside the bumper of the Shelby and trace my finger along the curve of the fender, remembering the pride in my husband's eyes when he first finished restoring it. This was the room where I cried after his funeral, sitting on the cold concrete floor with his jacket wrapped around my shoulders. This was the room where I kept the last pieces of him safe. And now it was clean, too clean, sanitized of history, as if nothing meaningful had ever existed there at all. I stood in the center, feeling the quiet throb in my temples, and something inside me, something I had held together with determination and excuses for too many years, cracked. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to let the truth seep through. They didn't think I mattered anymore. Not my memories, not my boundaries, not my attachment to the life I had built with the man I loved. They had decided for me what was worth keeping. And while I had spent years trying to be the easy one, the cooperative one, the mother who didn't demand too much, they had interpreted my gentleness as permission. That was the moment, standing in that emptied-out room with the smell of dust and concrete filling my lungs, when the betrayal completed itself. Not when they sold the Shelby, not when they cleared the shelves, but when I realized they hadn't even considered that I would come here, that I would see the aftermath with my own eyes. They had acted as if I were already gone. And that, more than anything else, was the wound that would not heal. When I left the empty storage unit that morning, I thought the worst of the betrayal had already settled, that there was no deeper layer left to peel back. But I was wrong in the way. Only someone who has spent her whole life offering benefit of the doubt can be wrong, believing that there must be a misunderstanding, that surely my son would explain everything once he realized how deeply this had wounded me. I drove home slowly, the world outside my windshield taking on the dim, flattened look of a place you've lived in too long, where each streetlight feels like the echo of a memory rather than something that exists in the present. And when I parked in my driveway, I sat there for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel, listening to the faint ticking of the cooling engine, reluctant to step out into a house that suddenly felt too small to contain what I now carried. Inside me, I kept thinking that if I just breathed long enough, the ache in my chest would shrink until I could file it away like everything else I had taught myself to endure silently. But pain, I've learned, doesn't shrink out of courtesy. It expands to fill whatever space you give it, and by the time I walked through my front door, it had already begun to reshape the walls of my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. The house smelled faintly of lavender detergent and the lingering sweetness of the apple cake I'd baked 2 days earlier, the kind of smell that usually comforted me. But that afternoon, it felt like a reminder of how much effort I had poured into moments no one appreciated anymore. I set my keys on the table, took off my coat, and moved through the room slowly, as though I were inspecting the life of a stranger. Nothing looked different, yet everything did, because I now knew there was no safe place in my world untouched by the quiet, dismissive hands of people I had once trusted without hesitation. I made myself a cup of tea, even though the thought of drinking it made my stomach tighten, and sat down at the small round kitchen table. For a while, I did nothing but stare at the rising steam, and it occurred to me that this was the first time in years I truly felt alone. Not the peaceful solitude I used to cherish, but the raw, exposed aloneness of someone who has been quietly pushed to the farthest edge of her own life. I thought about calling my son right then, asking him why, demanding some explanation that could make sense of what had happened. But I didn't trust my voice not to tremble, and I knew if I cried, he would interpret it not as pain, but as proof that I was fragile, unsteady, overly emotional. And that would give him another excuse to take more decisions out of my hands. So instead I waited. I folded a kitchen towel. I wiped down a counter that didn't need it. I tried to distract myself with meaningless movement because sitting still meant feeling everything fully. And I wasn't ready for that yet. But distraction can only carry you so far. And eventually, I found myself standing at the window, looking out at the small front yard where the hydrangeas had just started to bloom. Their soft blue petals moved gently in the breeze, unaware of the quiet unraveling inside the house. My husband planted those hydrangeas for me on our 35th anniversary, digging into the soil with the stubborn patience he always had when he wanted to make something beautiful last. I remember telling him that flowers were temporary, that they would bloom for a season and then fade. And he said, "Everything fades, Mar. The point is what they mean while they're here." I held on to that memory like a fragile thread, letting it anchor me as the weight of the betrayal pressed harder against my ribs. Later that afternoon, my son finally called, not because he sensed I needed him, but because I suspect the storage manager mentioned I had visited. His voice was steady, too steady, the way people speak when they're trying to guide a conversation toward a predetermined conclusion. He asked how I was, whether I had eaten, as though politeness could cover the cracks. I told him I had gone to the unit and found it empty. There was a long silence then, one of those silences that stretches out like a held breath, revealing everything a person doesn't say. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that careful, condescending warmth that adult children sometimes adopt when speaking to aging parents. He said he thought he was helping me, that the unit had become too much for me to manage, that I didn't need all those old things, that memories weren't stored in objects, but in hearts. It sounded like a line he had rehearsed, a justification he had prepared long before I ever found out what had happened. There was a thin tremor in my hands as I held the phone to my ear, but I kept my voice even, because I knew that any sign of distress would be used as evidence that I was overwhelmed, that I couldn't handle the responsibilities of my own life. He told me that his wife had been trying to make things easier, that they had simplified, that I should be grateful I no longer had to pay the monthly fees. Grateful, as though the loss of everything I held dear were a favor done on my behalf. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said, "You had no right," and the silence that followed was sharp, brittle, full of a tension he didn't know how to navigate. He muttered something about practicality, about moving forward, about decluttering, and I realized in that moment that he genuinely believed he had acted reasonably. That was the part that stung most sharply. The realization that the pain he caused me wasn't a side effect, but an afterthought, an inconvenience he hadn't even bothered to imagine. After the call ended, I stood in the middle of the living room, feeling the air around me shift. Something subtle but irreversible had taken root. The betrayal had begun with the clearing of the unit, but the escalation came in the hours and days that followed. In the countless small ways my son and daughter-in-law started tightening their grip on the narrative, subtly painting themselves as the caretakers of a confused, aging woman who didn't know what was best for herself. They changed their tone with me, adopting that overly patient cadence people use with children. My daughter-in-law began messaging me reminders about medications I had taken faithfully for years without issue. My son started dropping hints that my house was a lot to manage alone, and that maybe we should think about other options for my future. And as these small intrusions multiplied, the shape of their intentions grew clearer. They saw the clearing of the storage unit not as an intrusion, but as a precedent. They had crossed one boundary, and finding no resistance, they were already calculating the next. I heard it in every softened word, every sigh heavy with manufactured concern, every unsolicited suggestion that framed my independence as a risk. Each conversation chipped a little deeper, Each gentle nudge felt like a hand pushing me toward a place I didn't want to go, and it was in that slow, relentless pressure that the true escalation unfolded. Not in the dramatic act of selling my belongings, but in the quiet construction of a cage they believed I wouldn't notice until I was already inside it. The turning point, if I had to choose one, did not arrive with some blazing revelation or an angry confrontation the way people like to imagine their lives change. It came in the form of a phone number, scribbled on the back of an envelope, and the memory of a man's careless laugh echoing in my ear like the tail end of a cruel joke. For days after the visit to the empty storage unit, I moved through my house like someone rehearsing the motions of a life she no longer believed in. I did my laundry, watered the plants, wiped the kitchen counters until they were as bare and polished as the concrete floor where the Shelby used to sit. And all the while, a question gnawed at me with stubborn persistence. What exactly had that buyer seen, and what, if anything, was left of my husband's world in his hands? My son continued to call with that new, patient tone, circling back to the same topics: my health, my house, my future, with the quiet insistence of someone pushing a heavy piece of furniture across a room 1 inch at a time, pretending he was only straightening things. My daughter-in-law sent texts filled with suggestions about pill organizers and safer bathroom mats, each message threaded through with the unspoken assumption that I was one misstep away from disaster and needed to be buffered, managed, gently contained. I replied politely, the way you do with distant relatives and bureaucrats, because I understood now that politeness was my last remaining camouflage. I could not afford to show them the full depth of my anger. Rage, in a woman my age, is never seen as justified. It is written off as instability, as confusion, as evidence that she should not be trusted with her own decisions. So I swallowed the rage and let it settle where the grief already lived, and in the quiet that followed, a different emotion began to surface. Something smaller, sharper, less heavy than sorrow. It was resolve. One evening, after another phone call that left me feeling both infantilized and invisible, I went to the kitchen drawer where I keep things that might be needed someday: rubber bands, spare keys, an old tape measure, the warranties for appliances that no longer work, business cards from plumbers and electricians, fragments of practicality. The card from the buyer was there, half tucked under a faded notepad. I picked it up and studied the ink, slightly smudged where his thumb had pressed against the paper. I remembered his voice on the phone, the way his laughter had wavered when he realized I didn't know what my family had done. That laugh had not been entirely unkind. It had been startled, baffled, as though he had been handed a role in a story he didn't want any part of. The next morning, before I had time to talk myself out of it, I dialed the number. It rang twice, and when he answered, his voice was rough with sleep, or perhaps with the residue of too many long days. But there was caution in it, too, the way people sound when they're waiting to see if a call will bring trouble. I told him my name, told him I was the woman whose things he had bought from the storage unit, and there was a long pause, followed by a breath that sounded almost like relief. He said he had been expecting this call, or dreading it. He wasn't sure which. He admitted that when he'd realized what he had purchased for so little, he'd felt uneasy, that he had called me half out of guilt and half out of disbelief that anyone would sell such a car and so many tools for $200. He said he hadn't meant to laugh at me, only at the absurdity of it all. I believed him. There is a quality to genuine discomfort that is hard to fake, and I could hear it in the way his words tripped over one another. Without planning to, I asked if I could come see what he still had, if he'd kept anything besides the Shelby, which he admitted he had already resold to a collector who knew its worth. My voice didn't shake when I asked, and I took that as a small mercy. He hesitated, then said yes, that he would be in his workshop all afternoon, that I could come by if I wanted. No obligation, no promises, but that it felt wrong not to at least give me the chance to see what had become of my husband's things. He gave me the address, a place on the industrial edge of town where auto shops and warehouses cluster together like exiles from the shinier parts of the city. And after I hung up, I stood in the hallway with the phone still in my hand, surprised by my own decisiveness. There was nothing in this visit that could reverse what had been done. The Shelby would not magically reappear under my hands. My husband's jacket would not be draped over its seat waiting for me. The unit would not refill itself with carefully labeled boxes. But the idea of letting the story end with me sitting passively in my kitchen felt suddenly unbearable. I might not be able to reclaim what they had taken, but I could at least bear witness to its passing. In a world so eager to declare me irrelevant, that felt like an act of defiance. I drove out there on a gray afternoon, the sky low and swollen, pressing down on the rows of squat buildings and cracked asphalt like a hand. The address led me to a narrow lot flanked by chain-link fences and a small building with a roll-up door half open, a rectangle of shadow yawning behind it. As I pulled in, I saw the man from the phone standing near the entrance, wiping his hands on a rag. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his late 40s, with oil-stained fingers and tired eyes that softened when he saw me step out of the car. He didn't laugh this time. He walked toward me slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. He introduced himself with a name I immediately forgot, because in that moment, he was not a person so much as a bridge, a connection between the life I had lost and the one I was being pushed toward. He led me inside, and the smell of grease and metal wrapped around me like an old, rough blanket. There were parts and tools everywhere, but I recognized some of them instantly. The red hydraulic jack my husband had insisted on buying because a man should be able to lift his own car. The rolling stool with the taped cushion, the dented blue toolbox with the chipped paint on the corner. My hand moved to my chest as if to steady my heart, but I kept walking. He gestured toward a section of the shop where he had arranged the items from the unit. Not out of respect, he admitted later, but because he hadn't known what to do with them yet. He had bought everything as a lot, thinking he would resell the usable pieces and scrap the rest. But when he opened the boxes and saw how carefully everything had been wrapped and labeled, he felt strange about breaking it up. "This wasn't junk," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Someone loved this stuff." I stepped closer and saw my husband's handwriting on the masking tape labels, still steady, still neat, and for a moment I felt as though he were standing beside me, nodding in that satisfied way he used to when a project was organized just right. I ran my fingers lightly over the words: carburetor parts, electrical, misc, bolts, and the touch grounded me more firmly than any comforting phrase my family had offered in years. This, I thought, this is what respect looks like. The preservation of a person's order. The acknowledgement that their systems and preferences had meaning, even if they are gone. The man watched me in silence, giving me space. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. He said he had already sold the Shelby, that the moment he realized what it was, he had contacted a collector he knew, someone who would restore it further and keep it as a showpiece. He seemed ashamed of this, perhaps expecting me to scream at him or accuse him of theft, but I surprised both of us by simply nodding. The car had never really been mine to keep. It had belonged to my husband, to his dream of himself as a man capable of rescuing something beautiful from neglect. That dream had died with him long before the car left the storage unit. What I wanted now were not the grand symbols, but the small, tangible echoes of his hands. I asked, with as much composure as I could manage, whether I might buy back some of the smaller things, the jacket if it was there, the toolbox, anything that still carried the imprint of who he had been. The man shook his head, not in refusal, but in disbelief. He said I didn't need to buy them back, that he'd paid next to nothing for the lot, and that it didn't feel right to charge me for pieces of my own life. He began gathering things: a worn leather keychain shaped like a horseshoe, the faded shop rags my husband always kept folded in a stack, the small radio he used to balance on the workbench, tuned to an oldies station. Then he handed me a cardboard box with the care of someone passing an infant to its mother. In that moment, something inside me shifted again. Only this time it was not a crack, but a click. The quiet locking into place of a new understanding. I realized that my son and his wife were not the sole arbiters of my reality, that there were still people in the world capable of recognizing the weight of what had been taken from me and responding with simple, unadorned decency. I realized, too, that I did not have to accept their version of the story, where I was a confused old woman grateful for their interventions. I could write my own account, one where I was not a problem to be solved, but a person who had been wronged and who had every right to protect what remained of her dignity. When I left the shop, the box on the passenger seat and the faint smell of oil lingering in my clothes, I did not feel fixed or whole. Grief and betrayal do not dissolve so easily, but I felt anchored. I had done something they would not have expected from me. I had stepped out of the narrow role they had written for me and acted in my own interest without asking anyone's permission. Driving home, the streets looked different, not because they had changed, but because I was seeing them from a slightly altered height, as though I had straightened my spine by a fraction of an inch. I knew the real battles were still ahead. I knew my son would interpret my visit to the buyer as proof that I was dwelling on the past, and my insistence on reclaiming those items as an unhealthy attachment. I knew my daughter-in-law would sigh and talk about emotional hoarding, as if the heart were something that needed to be cleared out with a broom. But I also knew, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was no longer willing to let their interpretations go unchallenged inside my own head. They could say what they liked to each other, to their friends, to whatever professionals they were already imagining bringing into the conversation. I would not stop them, but I would not echo their words back to myself anymore. I would not call their violation a kindness. I would not call their theft a favor. Somewhere between the emptiness of that storage unit and the cluttered kindness of the buyer's shop, I had crossed a small but crucial threshold. I was still the same 78-year-old woman living alone in a modest house filled with fading photographs and hand-me-down furniture. But I was also, once again, the woman my husband used to look at when he said, half in jest and half in admiration, "You're tougher than you look, Mar." And for the first time in a very long time, I believed him. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that reclaiming even a small box of my husband's things would satisfy some unspoken ledger inside my son and his wife, that maybe the fact I had handled everything quietly would ease whatever tension they felt about the situation. But instead, it did the opposite, stirring up a new, more insidious energy between us, the kind that doesn't arrive in direct confrontation, but slips beneath the surface like a slow leak poisoning the water before anyone notices the taste. The morning after my visit to the buyer's shop, My daughter-in-law called me with a calm, brittle tone so polished it might as well have been lacquered onto her throat, and she asked without asking why I had gone behind their backs, framing my visit as a clandestine act rather than a natural reaction to having my possessions erased. She spoke in that professional softness she uses when talking to people she considers fragile or inconvenient, telling me she understood that grief can cloud judgment, and I listened to her voice with a kind of hollow amazement, stunned not by the cruelty, but by the efficiency with which she had learned to reshape her own choices into my alleged instability. I tried to explain, gently at first, that the man had contacted me, that I simply wanted to see what was left. But she sighed the way people sigh when they believe they are dealing with a child, not a grown woman with decades more life behind her than she has lived herself. And she said that it wasn't healthy for me to dwell on the past, that my attachment to sentimental clutter was a sign I was struggling to let go. It would have been almost laughable if it hadn't been so dangerous. Because there was a new texture in her voice, a subtle firmness beneath the veneer of concern that told me she had moved from justification to strategy, and strategy, in the hands of someone like her, is far more frightening than blunt malice. She told me she had spoken to my son about next steps, that they were considering bringing in a specialist to assess my needs, using the kind of language people use when they are preparing to take away a person's autonomy, while insisting they are doing it for their own good. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, not in fear, but in a steady, rising anger that felt as though it came from my bones rather than my chest. And for a moment I didn't trust myself to speak, because if I let even a sliver of my fury slip through, she would seize on it as proof that I was losing control. So I steadied my voice and told her I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, that I appreciated their concern but did not require intervention, and her silence in response was sharp enough to draw blood. When she finally spoke, it was with a clipped gentleness that felt like someone closing a door right in front of me. She said, we should revisit the conversation after she and my son had time to discuss what would be best. Not what I wanted, not what I needed, what would be best. For whom, I wondered, but I already knew the answer. It was later that afternoon that my son arrived without warning, knocking once before letting himself in, the way he used to when he was a teenager coming home late. Except this time, there was no sheepish grin or half-mumbled apology, only the stiff discomfort of a man trying to rehearse authority he wasn't sure he possessed. He stood in the doorway of my living room, his hands tucked awkwardly into his jacket pockets, and he looked at me with a complicated expression, something between disappointment and worry, as if I had become a problem he hadn't predicted. He said he had something he needed to talk to me about, and his voice had that gentle, measured cadence that people use when they are preparing to deliver news they expect will upset you. I invited him to sit, though I didn't want him to, and he lowered himself onto the sofa like a man sitting on a fragile antique he was afraid might collapse under him. He told me he was worried about me, that I had been acting impulsively, that driving to see the buyer was risky, especially given my age, and that the stress of the situation seemed to be affecting my judgment. He said all of this without looking me in the eye, as though bracing himself for the backlash he assumed I wouldn't have the strength to deliver. I listened, not because I valued his assessment, but because I wanted to understand how thoroughly they had convinced themselves that they were in the right. When he mentioned the possibility of a cognitive evaluation, something inside me went very still, like a pond surface freezing in real time, smooth and impenetrable. He said it softly, as if suggesting a harmless checkup, but I could hear the undercurrent beneath it. The implication that once a professional was involved, once a label was applied, whatever happened after could be justified with the language of medical necessity. He talked about safety, about planning for the future, about avoiding stressful attachments. And though he never said it directly, I could hear what he meant. He and his wife wanted control, not of my life necessarily, but of the parts of it that touched theirs, the parts that required effort, patience, or presence. I asked him as calmly as I could why neither of them had told me about clearing the unit, and he shifted uncomfortably, saying he thought I would overreact, that I had been too emotional about the past lately, that it was healthier for me not to deal with the burden of those things anymore. He spoke about my memories as if they were an illness, something to be managed. I pressed further, asking who had signed the form authorizing the disposal, and he admitted, reluctantly, that his wife had, because it was more efficient. The way he said efficient made my stomach turn, because it was the same word she had used to describe a method of cleaning, clinical, impersonal, devoid of respect. When he left, I felt the walls of my house lean inward, not physically, but emotionally, as though the very structure sensed the tightening circle around me. I knew then that the escalation wasn't going to come in the form of a fight or a single dramatic confrontation, but through a slow siphoning away of decision after decision, until I was left with nothing but choices pre-selected for me. They wanted a reason to declare me unsteady. They wanted justification for the power they were already reaching for. They wanted to present their takeover as care. In the days that followed, the pressure increased not with volume, but with frequency. A series of small intrusions that eroded my peace like water wearing down stone. My daughter-in-law sent me articles about downsizing in your senior years, accompanied by bright, chirpy messages about living lighter. My son called daily, asking if I was remembering to eat, if I had considered medical alert devices, if I had thought more about future accommodations. There was a relentlessness to it, a creeping insistence that I was somehow incomplete, incapable, unprepared. Once he even offered to help me sort through my paperwork, a phrase that carried such obvious subtext that I felt physically cold hearing it. They wanted access to my records, my finances, my decisions. And behind every polite suggestion was a shadow, the quiet threat of what would happen if I refused. It escalated further when I found out they had contacted my doctor without telling me, asking for information about my medications for safety reasons. They framed it as concern when confronted, insisting they only wanted to ensure I was managing everything properly. But the truth was unmistakable. They were building a case, not legally perhaps, not formally, but emotionally, psychologically, in the eyes of anyone who might later need to be convinced. They wanted a narrative of decline. They wanted a story where they were the caretakers and I was the dependent. It was a story that erased everything I had been, everything I had lived through, everything I still was. The breaking point came quietly on a Thursday afternoon when a letter arrived addressed to me, but written in my daughter-in-law's handwriting. Inside was a brochure for a senior living community 2 towns over, along with a printed note that said, "Just something to think about. We want you somewhere safe." Safe, in their language, meant contained. Safe meant out of the way. Safe meant stripped of the remnants of my own life so that theirs could proceed without inconvenience. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I had cried over the empty storage unit, and held that brochure in my hands until my fingers trembled. Not from fear, from clarity. A clarity so sharp It felt like stepping barefoot onto ice. They were not going to stop. They had taken the storage unit not just out of carelessness, but as a test balloon, a preparation for a larger project of restructuring my life according to their comfort. They had seen how I swallowed my pain quietly, how I responded politely even when gutted, and they mistook that for acquiescence. They believed they could continue absorbing pieces of my autonomy until one day I simply no longer possessed it. But what they had failed to understand about women like me, women who spent decades smoothing the lives of others, women who held families together through storms, women who bent until bending became our natural shape, is that when we finally stop bending, we don't spring back gently. We snap into a form so solid and deliberate that it cannot be bent again. When I folded the brochure and placed it neatly in the trash, a calmness settled over me. Not the fragile quiet of defeat, but the dense, grounded stillness of a decision fully made. They had escalated the pressure. Now I would escalate my response. Not with shouting, not with demands, not with a war, but with boundaries so firm they would feel like walls. Boundaries backed by documentation, by counsel, by the strength they underestimated because they had forgotten who taught them what resilience looked like. Boundaries they could neither reshape nor ignore. They thought they were pushing an old woman into a smaller life. They had no idea they were pushing her into resistance. I did not wake up that morning planning to take action of any kind, and yet when I opened my eyes, long before the sun had fully climbed over the roofs across the street, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness bloom inside me. A quiet, grounded certainty that whatever happened next could no longer be shaped by their preferences or softened by my willingness to be accommodating. The air in my bedroom was cool in that early hour when the world is still half asleep. And as I sat up, smoothing the wrinkles from the blanket with slow, deliberate strokes, I realized that the fear they had tried to cultivate in me had evaporated overnight, leaving behind a clarity that felt almost physical, like the moment when storm clouds finally break and the pressure in your skull lifts. I moved through the house with an unusual sense of purpose, gathering documents from drawers I had organized years ago, locating the worn leather folder where my husband and I had once kept everything important: wills, insurance forms, property, papers, receipts from the storage unit, even the faded photograph he had taken the day we bought the Shelby, the one where I am standing beside the open hood, laughing at something he had said. I placed everything on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of tea, the steam rising in thin, translucent threads that mingled with the morning light spilling across the floor. There was no drama in my movements, no trembling, just an almost eerie calm, as though I were performing a ritual I had practiced in another life. I did not imagine myself brave or defiant. I felt more like a woman who had finally stepped into the truth she had been avoiding. By the time the clock on the microwave struck 9, I had already dressed, tied my hair back, and walked out the front door with my folder tucked under my arm like a shield carved from memory and paper. I drove to a small law office near the courthouse, one I had passed countless times without ever imagining I would need its services. The receptionist at the front desk greeted me with a polite, distracted smile. But when I explained why I was there, her expression shifted from courtesy to something softer, almost protective, as though she recognized the particular tremor in my voice that comes not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of being pushed too far for too long. The attorney who met with me was a quiet man with silver-rimmed glasses and a manner that conveyed patience rather than urgency. Someone who listened not for the sake of efficiency, but because he had learned long ago that older women speak truths. Others refused to hear. He asked me to tell him everything, and I did. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with the slow precision of someone laying out objects one by one on a table so that nothing can be dismissed or overlooked. I told him about the storage unit, about the unauthorized access, the forged signature, the sudden pressure to move, the way my son and his wife had begun crafting a narrative around my supposed fragility. I showed him the receipts, the rental agreement, the letter with the brochure, even the photograph of the Shelby, explaining its history and its worth. He listened without interruption, though I could see the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the folder when I recounted how the man at the storage facility had believed my daughter-in-law had full authority to dispose of my belongings. When I had finished, he leaned back in his chair and regarded me for a long moment before saying that what they had done was not simply inconsiderate or unkind, but legally actionable. He explained the avenues we could take: a formal complaint for unauthorized sale of personal property, a petition to ensure no one, not a relative, not a spouse, not a caretaker, could act on my behalf without my explicit written consent, and documentation establishing my cognitive and legal independence in a way that could not be twisted or reinterpreted to suit someone else's agenda. His language was clear, not condescending, and as he spoke, I felt the invisible cage they had been constructing around me begin to fracture, its bars no longer solid, but brittle. I signed papers with a firm hand, the pen gliding across the page with the weight of intention. Each signature stirred a memory of the woman I had been long before my son was born, long before the slow erosion of years had convinced me that silence and gentleness were the safest paths. When the final document was signed, the attorney stood, walked around his desk, and placed a copy of the protective order into my hands. It was a thin stack of pages, hardly impressive at first glance, but as I held it, I understood that it represented a barrier they could not cross, not with excuses, not with manipulations, not with their curated concern. The power they had been quietly collecting had just slipped out of their grasp. When I returned home, the house felt different, not safer, not warmer, but grounded, as though I had anchored something invisible into the floorboards. I set the folder on the table and allowed myself a long breath, but before I could sit down, I heard the front door open. My son called out my name with a brightness too deliberate to be natural, and when he stepped into the kitchen, he wore the expression of a man ready to persuade, to cajole, to steer the conversation toward his predetermined conclusion. He said they had found another brochure, a better option, a place with gardens and activities and a supportive community. And as he reached into his jacket to pull out the pamphlet, I felt the last flicker of my old self, the obedient, accommodating version finally extinguish. I told him to sit. He did, though confusion flickered across his face like a passing shadow. I placed the attorney's documents in front of him, watching as his eyes scanned the words, his posture stiffening. He looked up at me and asked what this was, his voice thinner now, stretched tight. I told him calmly, clearly, that he and his wife no longer had any authority over my affairs, that any attempt to intervene on my behalf without my explicit request would be considered legal overreach, and that what had been done to my storage unit was already being addressed. He opened his mouth, but whatever he intended to say faltered under the weight of the paper in his hands. He shifted the pages as if hoping they would rearrange themselves into something less damning, but they did not. He tried to explain, to soften, to retreat into the old language of concern, but his words slid off me like water running down glass. I told him I was fully capable of managing my life, that the betrayal was not the clearing of the unit, but the belief that I would fold beneath the loss without question. He looked at me then, not as his mother, not as someone whose tears he could dismiss or whose silence he could reshape, but as a person standing firmly in front of him, unmovable. A person with agency. A person who could no longer be handled. He left without slamming the door, but the silence afterward felt like the soft echo of something collapsing far away, the slow crumble of a structure built on assumptions that no longer held. I walked to the window and watched him get into his car, his shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the steering wheel as though unsure where to go. And in that moment, I realized this was the culmination not of a single act, but of years of slow erasure. Years in which I had allowed myself to be minimized for the sake of peace. The decisive act I had taken did not restore what I had lost, but it restored me to myself, and that, in the end, was the only reclamation that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the house settled into a quieter rhythm. Not the hollow kind of quiet that used to unnerve me after my husband passed, but a steady, grounded silence. The kind that comes when the air is finally allowed to rest without being disturbed by someone else's plans for your life. I woke each morning not with dread or confusion, but with a subtle, unfamiliar sense of ownership over my own hours, as though I had reclaimed something far more precious than the objects that had been stolen from me. The papers from the attorney remained on my kitchen table for a while, not because I needed to study them again, but because their presence reminded me that I had stepped out of a shadow I didn't realize I had been living under. A shadow formed not from malice, but from the slow, steady erosion of being dismissed, managed, and softened out of my own story. My son's calls became infrequent, not hostile or dramatic, simply hesitant, his voice thinner, stripped of the confident undertone he once carried when speaking to me. And though part of me mourned the distance growing between us, another part recognized that this space was necessary, that he needed time to recalibrate his understanding of who I was and who I would no longer allow myself to be. My daughter-in-law stopped sending articles and suggestions altogether, and I could almost sense her discomfort whenever she texted brief, polite messages that floated on the surface without probing deeper, as though she feared touching whatever strength she now suspected lived beneath my voice. On a quiet afternoon, I found myself unpacking the box the buyer had given me, laying each item out on the dining table the way a curator might prepare an exhibit of small, intimate artifacts. There was the worn leather keychain shaped like a horseshoe, which my husband used to twirl absent-mindedly between his fingers whenever he was thinking. There was the radio he always tuned to the oldies station, static humming faintly in the background while he worked. There were the shop rags he insisted on washing himself, even when I told him they were too far gone. And there was the dented blue toolbox, heavier than I remembered, carrying the quiet gravity of a man's hands. His dedication, his patience, his version of love. I didn't cry when I touched them. Grief had already carved its cavern years ago, and what I felt now was not sorrow, but a warm, steady recognition. A kind of reunion, not with the past, but with the parts of myself that had been wrapped away along with those boxes. As I ran my fingers over the metal and the fading fabric, I understood that reclaiming these objects was not an act of clinging, but an act of honoring, a way of affirming that my memories were not clutter, not burdens, not evidence of decline, but threads of a life lived with depth and care. One evening, after a long stretch of golden light had washed over the living room and softened every corner of the house, I sat outside on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the hydrangeas sway gently in the breeze. Their petals had deepened in color since spring, a richer blue now, the same shade as the car my husband restored decades ago, and I felt something release inside me, a small untangling of the last knot of resentment I had carried. I thought about the day the buyer handed me the box, about the look on my son's face when he realized I had drawn a boundary he couldn't cross, about the empty storage unit that had once held so much of our life. And I realized that the emptiness I had feared was not a void, but a clearing, a space where something new could take root. Peace, perhaps, or simply the recognition that solitude is not the same as abandonment when it is chosen rather than imposed. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, I felt a quiet certainty settle around me, the kind that doesn't announce itself with triumph or celebration, but with a gentle, almost tender acknowledgement. I had survived the kind of loss that doesn't get eulogized, the loss of trust, the loss of consideration, the loss of being seen. And not only had I survived it, I had stepped through it into a life that belonged wholly to me again. I thought of other women my age, women who sit at kitchen tables swallowing their hurt, women whose children believe aging is a symptom of incompetence, women whose memories are treated as sentimental debris. And as the night deepened, I wished I could speak to them directly, not with advice or slogans, but with the truth I had learned slowly and painfully, that the world will shrink you if you let it, that kindness can become a cage when offered without respect, and that the moment you decide to take up your rightful space again, the ground beneath your feet will stop trembling. Before going inside, I whispered into the darkness, not expecting anyone to hear, but knowing the words needed to be released into the open air. If someone ever tries to decide your worth for you, do not argue, do not plead, do not shrink. Simply stand, even if you are trembling. The world has a way of straightening itself around a woman who finally stands tall. I turned off the porch light, closed the door gently behind me, and carried my box of reclaimed memories to the place I had already cleared for them. Not a shrine, not a memorial, but a corner of my home that now felt entirely, unquestionably, my own.